is Matthew 16:24 through 28. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what they have done. Truly, I say to you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." The word of the Lord.
Morning, everybody. I'm Mike. I'm one of the pastors here. Good to see y'all. If you're new, I'd love to get to know you. Let's make that happen somehow. I got a lot of new people here, and yeah, just glad they're here. And for those who have come back, thanks for coming back. Appreciate all of you as well. How many of you like biographies? Biographies? Oh yeah, we got some biographies. I love a good biography. And I actually learned to love biographies when I made a connection that they're actually some of the best leadership books that you can read. Because the typical leadership book that you're reading is about theory, right? This is in a situation, what should a leader do or not do? What should an organization look like or not look like? Or, there's usually a widget involved somewhere, right, in the examples that are given. But life isn't ideal, right? And all of those books take place in ideal circumstances. If the leader just pulls the right lever, does the right things, then they're going to have wild success. A biography, though, is a little bit different in terms of a leadership book, because what you're doing is you're connecting theory to practice. And you're seeing what happens when the scenarios aren't ideal. What is it that a leader is supposed to actually do? What are the decisions that she's supposed to make? What are the mistakes that she's going to make? What are the results of the course that's set in real life with real circumstances? Theory meets practice. When we think about the gospel, or when we think about other concepts that are in the Bible, some of those things might feel theoretical to us in some way. Now, the Bible has all kinds of biographical stories that are in there, and there are lots of circumstances in the Bible that are not ideal. Many, many circumstances like that. But until something like the gospel actually connects to our real life, then it ends up remaining as something that is just theory. Until we learn how it is that Jesus interacts with who I am in my real messy circumstances, and then how do I believe the gospel in the midst of my circumstances, if you believe the gospel, and then how do I follow Jesus daily? How do I learn to trust him regularly as I'm going through life? We're entering into this new series right now called This Is My Story. And basically we've selected some people from the church, and we're gonna hear their stories of how they first encountered Jesus, how they first encountered the gospel and came to faith. And then what is that doing in their lives currently? We're gonna see what happens when the theory gets applied to a messy situation, and then the transformation that ends up taking place in non-ideal circumstances. And what you're gonna see is that these people are still in process. And not that you're gonna see that they're in process up here on stage. They're gonna be great, everything's gonna be wonderful. But like you and I, we're all in process, right? We're trying to figure out what this looks like to follow Jesus, or we're just encountering him for the first time, maybe even today, and wondering, how do we actually follow in real life? What does that look like? Your story is important. We might call your story of coming to faith, sometimes we'll use the word testimony. And if you see the word testimony in the scriptures, you might think of something like a witness. A witness is somebody who testifies about something that they have seen and experienced for themselves. If you picture like a courtroom kind of scene, a witness who's giving testimony in a courtroom, they have to say something that is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, right? Your testimony is the truth of who Jesus is and how it actually connects to who you are and the ways that you've experienced that, the ways that you have witnessed that in life. And that spoken truth of who Jesus is and how you've seen him is an important story. That truth about Jesus, that spoken word about Jesus, is powerful as well. The Apostle John, he's going to write to the church at some point, and he says this about the church. He says, they triumphed over him, the devil, by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. Which really tells me that there's something about the existence of the church that actually depends on us continually proclaiming what the truth of who Jesus is all the time. That's what the church does, continually proclaims the truth of who Jesus is. Your story is important. Your story should be told. And I hope that you get many opportunities and that you have the courage in the moment and that you experience the joy from the result of it, of being able to share your story of how you've encountered Jesus many times and in many different contexts. What we've done here for this series is we've selected a few of you in order to be able to share what that story is like. And how is Jesus affecting you right now? And the goal in all of this, one, is that I hope we'd be encouraged when we hear these stories. We might be challenged when we hear these stories in some way. But ultimately, I hope people are just drawn to Jesus when these stories are told. Yeah, I'll just say, we had 2 people who came to faith during the first service. And that's the prayer throughout this whole series. People are going to share their stories, and hopefully it just points people to Jesus. So our testimony today is going to come from Kacy. Kacy, I want to invite you up to share your story. Let's give her a warm welcome here.
Thanks, Mike. Hi. Okay, here's my story. When I was growing up, you wouldn't have found me or my family in a place like this. I had very little exposure to church, to God, or to the Bible. But in my hour of need, Jesus rescued me. When I was in high school, I put up a front as a small town kid with big dreams. But it was a facade. Just a few years prior, my dad had walked out of our family. He had opted for a better, different family. There wasn't room for me to hold my sadness, and there weren't others around who had that capacity either. I felt the pain of others acutely. My mom's broken heart, my dad's foolish dreams, and later bewildered regrets. My sister's door slammed shut. It shook me. I was hungry for truth, but I had no idea where to look. I was looking for something that was steadier than all the shifting sand around me. So I explored witchcraft, tarot cards, seances. I read self-help books. I meditated on the quotes that were found on the signs hanging in my cafeteria. If you can believe it, you can achieve it. Reach for the stars. I thought, that seems like a good way to live. And so I gave it my very best effort. And my life was a dizzying display of achievement and success. I took that tender pain, the layers upon layers of all of my noticing, and I did what at the time I did best. I ignored it. I took care of others, and I showed the world that I was worth something. I had perfect grades. I was class president. I got home late every night after a flurry of extracurricular activities. I was voted most likely to succeed. And I may have been, but I was also sad and scared and overwhelmed. And it was in this place that the kingdom of God broke into my life. Friends I'd known for years came back to school in the fall, having met Jesus at a Young Life camp that summer. They could not stop talking about Jesus. It took me all of 1 week to end up at a small Baptist church, hearing my friends pray to a God who heard them. 3 days later, I heard I could turn to Jesus too. In the pastor's sermon that Sunday, he talked about what it meant to follow Jesus. He said that before we come to faith, it's like we are walking in one direction. And then, turning to face the opposite side of the room, he said that when we follow Jesus, we walk in a different direction with Jesus. I didn't know much about God, but somehow I knew I wanted to turn and walk in his ways. I knew that I needed help. I walked to the altar at the end of the service, and I prayed a prayer of faith in Jesus, and my life has never been the same. I came to know the loving care of a father who would never leave, who would mend my broken heart. I was adopted into a church family, and what felt like the most vulnerable step, I learned to surrender control of my life. And when I surrendered, God met me. I read and reread the book of Psalms early on in my faith, and my heart found its way with Jesus. I cried out to him from the depth of my soul, and he never found me to be too much. He didn't ask me to carry everything I thought I had to carry. He asked me to lay it down. He invited me closer in, deeper still. I could feel all of the pain with his arms wrapped around me. All of that is a true part of my story, and I've told that story of my conversion, my testimony, many times. But I want to share something with you today, and that is that my tendency to revert to planning, scheming, and fighting to control the outcome of my life is a well-worn path, and I take it all the time. But God keeps inviting me back, and when I follow him, I find the same truth I stumbled onto as a high schooler. I don't need to prove my worth. I am his beloved daughter. In Matthew 16:25, Jesus said, "For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it." This is my story. Walking with Jesus is about losing life to find it. It was true when I was 16, and it is true today. When I was young, I thought for the world to make sense, I needed to be a hero, to succeed, to live a life that mattered. And to be honest, after I came to know Jesus, I kind of put a Christian spin on it, and I tried to be a Christian success story. I would tell the story I first told you about my initial life change with Jesus, which was true. But then, off of the stage and away from the lights, I would be desperately trying to prove my worth as a Christian. I thought that if I planned it just right, and if I worked hard enough, I could live a life like the Christian missionary biographies I read voraciously as a new believer. But here's the truth. I am not a Christian success story. My teenage self would have been devastated to know that I would drop out of Bible school to have a small mental breakdown, leading to an eating disorder that I tried to hide from everyone. A few years later, I would be deemed disqualified from ministry, and I would find myself awkwardly disclosing the details of a shameful experience in my seminary application with hopes that I could still be accepted into a program to study the Bible. And later, when, as a family, we served with all of our hearts at a church plant, we would leave completely depleted and without a success story to share from our years of service. If you were looking for a hero in the story, it's not me. Losing life to find it in Jesus has not only meant giving up my high school mindset of trying to be a person who mattered, it has also meant giving up what I thought it meant to matter in the kingdom of God. And just like when I first came to him, I can still pour my heart out to him, and he never finds me to be too much. I am his beloved daughter. He is full of grace and mercy. And this is the Jesus I know, who came as a baby and grew in wisdom, who welcomed children, who kept company with outcasts, and who faithfully finished the work that was given to him, even when to some it looked like failure and not success. As it turns out, almost this whole time, I have been looking for a success story, but Jesus has been looking to be with me.
Thank you, Kacy, so much for giving so much time to this. And it takes a lot of courage to stand in front of everybody and share something so personal. What I love about what Kacy shared is that ultimately it's not about achievement, right? Walking with Jesus isn't about achievement. It's really about receiving the grace that Jesus offers to be able to call you a beloved daughter or a beloved son of God. Kacy, in her testimony, she referenced this verse that Jesus says in Matthew chapter 16. So that's where we're going to be today. I'm going to teach an abbreviated little teaching on Matthew chapter 16. I'd love for you to follow along if you can. We're going to start in verse 24. You can look it up on a device if you want, or pull out a Bible. If you don't have a Bible, let us know. We'll try and get you one. Want to be able to get that in the hands of everybody that we can. We just wrapped up a series on the Gospel of John, and I loved the Gospel of John, but I got to tell you something, I really love the Gospel of Matthew. It's one of my favorites. If you are relatively new to following Jesus, the Gospel of Matthew is a fantastic place to learn what it's like to actually follow Jesus. Matthew, like John, was one of the 12 disciples. And so the Gospel of Matthew is his eyewitness account of the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus and all the things that were happening around there. Now, each of the gospel writers, they're telling that same story, but they're telling it from different angles, or they're putting different framework around it. And what Matthew does is he takes what he thinks are the most important teachings from Jesus, and he brings them together into 5 specific big blocks of teaching within his story. Now, 5 is an important number in the Bible. You might think about the first 5 books of the Bible, which sometimes are called the Torah or sometimes called the Pentateuch, which means 5 books. These are what we might consider the law or the instruction from God through Moses to the Israelites. Or you might think about the book of Psalms, which is broken up into 5 different books. Did you know the book of Psalms is actually 5 different books, which is really just a throwback to the Torah, to those first 5 books. There's always this sense of instruction that's coming along with that number 5. And in fact, that's what Matthew is doing. He's kind of framing up his story like, here's the new instruction from God that is coming through Jesus right now. And it's built on the foundation of everything that was written before. And in fact, the early church used the Gospel of Matthew as like a primer or a catechism for new followers of Jesus. These are the most fundamental teachings of Jesus that you need to know about. So that's the context of Matthew. Now, the passage that Kacy shared from, Matthew chapter 16, is basically right in the middle of Matthew's story. And it's actually an important turning point in the story as well. Right before the passage that we're going to look at today, and I mean like right before, there are 2 things that happens. The first is that Jesus asks a question. He says of his disciples, he's asking this question, who do you say that I am? And it's Peter who ends up giving the right answer. He says, you're the Messiah. You're the Son of the living God. Then the second thing that happens is that Jesus begins to tell his disciples that he's going to go to Jerusalem now, and he's going to suffer, and he's going to die. But God is going to raise him up from the dead. Once again, Peter has a response, but this time it wasn't so good. He actually rebukes Jesus. Can you believe the guy? He's like, no, that's not going to happen. But it did happen. And in fact, from this point in the story onward, Jesus is moving in that direction toward Jerusalem. And he's going to keep healing people, and he's going to keep teaching along the way, but he's really on the way to his death, to give up his life for the sake of other people. Okay, so it's in that context that we have these words from Jesus in Matthew chapter 16, starting in verse 24. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world and yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels. And then he will reward each person according to what they have done. Truly, I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Now, just real quick, that last sentence may raise some questions for you, but it's all connected to what happens right after that in chapter 17. We can't get into it right now, but if you read chapter 17, you'll see what Jesus is talking about in the final sentence of chapter 16. What we're going to focus on mostly is these really hard words from Jesus that you have to, as a follower of Jesus, deny yourself. Now, we don't probably like to hear things like that. Who wants to deny themselves of anything? Who wants to deny themselves at all? I mean, I think part of that probably has to do with that all of us, to varying degrees, are self-centered and selfish people. We like ourselves in some way, and we don't want to deny ourselves. Or maybe when we hear that, we just think, I guess I'm not important. I mean, if I have to deny myself, I must not be all that important. This word for deny, it gets used several times, but the Apostle Paul, he uses it when he's writing to Timothy, and he says this. Boom. Here is a trustworthy saying. If we died with him, with Christ, we will also live with him. If we endure, we will also reign with him. If we disown him, that's the word deny, it's the same word. If we disown him, he will also disown us. If we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. Well, that's interesting. Paul says that Jesus can't deny himself, but Jesus says we have to deny ourselves. That should raise some questions for us. We'll come back to that in a little bit. There's also this contrast that's happening in this passage between saving and losing. That's verse 25 here. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. Now, this word for losing, it isn't like I lost my car keys. It's more akin to destroying, which is a theme that we find throughout Scripture. People in the Bible are often faced with this challenge of they're either going to deal with salvation or they're going to deal with destruction. And I don't mean that just in some eternal way. I just mean it even it's described in day-to-day circumstances. You're going to deal with salvation or destruction in some way. And yet, what that really makes us see in these words from Jesus is that following Jesus is a high-risk venture. It's life or death. Matthew does not paint the picture of following Jesus as something that we do casually. He paints it as you're all in or you're all out. Yet at the same time, he's going to capture some other words from Jesus and highlight them at a different moment earlier on in the story. He's going to say this. Jesus is going to say, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." Now that word for soul there is the same word from our passage where Jesus says, if you try to save your life, that's the word right there, word for life. If you try to save your life, you're going to lose it. But if you lose your life for my sake, you're going to find it. It's really the same thing that Jesus is talking about. The word is psuche, and psuche is like a physical life aspect to it, but it's more than that as well. It's actually the wholeness of the integration of everything that we are comprised of. Our bodies, our minds, our hearts, our spirits, and that whole thing together we call the soul. Isn't that interesting though? So Jesus says that we have to lose our life, our soul, our psuche, but he also says he's going to give rest to our life, to our soul, to our psuche. There's another aspect of this passage that's kind of material or financial in some way. That comes from verse 26. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? This idea, these words for gain and for exchange, they're typically used in a financial sense, in a material sense in Scripture. You kind of get a sense from this in one of the parables, one of the stories that Jesus ends up telling. He tells a story of a master who gives 3 of his servants bags of gold, lots of money, and then the master goes away. And when he comes back, he calls his servants to find out what they had done with the money that he had entrusted to them. This is what happens when the first servant comes back. The servant says, "Master, you entrusted me with 5 bags of gold. I have gained," that's the same word, 5 more. And you know what ends up happening in the story is that the master gives him even more then. So he has a whole lot more gain that ends up coming his way. And in that parable from Jesus, that servant is viewed very favorably. Isn't that interesting? In that story from Jesus, it seems like if you gain more, that's a favorable thing. But in our passage, Jesus seems to be indicating that nothing else could be of greater gain to you. Is it even good to gain anything in the world? We'll come back to that. Jesus is really good at asking questions. And often the things that he says ends up raising a lot of questions for us as well. Well, how does that actually work? Or why is it this way in one instance and that way in another? Which just lets us know that when Jesus is saying these things, it's not all cut and dry. There isn't always an easy answer. And that's because we don't all live in ideal circumstances. So we have to try to apply the things that Jesus is saying into our messy lives, and into our non-ideal circumstances. And often what that does is it actually ends up raising more questions for us. How does this work? And when and how? I already said how. And why? Don't worry, I don't need to go through all of them. I'm going to give you 3 questions today to think about in response to this passage. The first question is, what are you afraid of? Come on, you chickens. What are you afraid of? What's your deepest fear? Oh, thank you, David. We don't need to expose all of our deepest fears right now, though. I appreciate David's willingness to jump in there, though. I'm afraid of dogs, personally. Why are you laughing, honey? I've always been afraid of dogs. That's because I've been attacked by dogs many times. I've been bitten in the face. I have a permanent scar on my right butt cheek. When I, all right, calm down. We'll get to that later. There you go. Calm down. When I was a kid, my sister trained our dog to attack me. So she would say, "Stick him, Bear," and Bear would oblige. Now, just in case your best friend happens to be a dog, I don't want to offend you at all. I actually love dogs a lot, and I have grown more comfortable around them, and I know that I just need to be confident around dogs, but I'm always a little bit leery because I've had some bad circumstances. But that's not really my deepest fear. My deeper fears have something more to do with, am I really valuable to other people? Am I able to actually contribute well in all of the most important areas of my life? Is my life going to count for something significant when I come to the end of it? Maybe you can relate to some of those fears. Or maybe your fears are different. Maybe you're afraid of being alone. Maybe you're afraid of things that have to do with safety and security. Like, something wrong is going to happen. I need to be prepared for all of those bad things that might happen. Or maybe you're afraid of clowns. Like this picture from the movie It. No, I'm just joking, I wouldn't do that. I'll do some questionable things, but I won't do that. Maybe you're afraid that you can't be loved for who you actually are. And so when you hear these words from Jesus, that you have to deny yourself, kind of strikes a chord for you in some way. Why does he say that? Why is it that Jesus can't deny himself, but we have to deny ourselves? Now, like I said, there are no clear-cut answers in all of these things because it's going to relate to us in different ways at different times in our lives. But I think a big aspect to it is that Jesus can't deny himself in his character, just like you and I can't deny ourselves in our character. I mean, we can allow Jesus to change our character, but we can't disown our character in any way. Really what this ends up doing is forcing us into a place where we can say, well, I can follow Jesus. And the way that Jesus actually embodied denying himself was by giving of himself for other people. He gave his life for the benefit of others. And what this ends up challenging in some way is a fear that maybe some of us have, that I need to take care of myself. Numero uno. I'm taking care of me. If I don't do something good for me, nobody else is going to do it. Or if I don't protect myself from bad things, nobody else is going to do it. But what that belief actually does deny is that Jesus cares about us and can care about us better than we can actually care for ourselves. So we don't need to take a posture of, I'm the most important person in my life to take care of. Because our lives belong to Jesus and they are in his hands. And we get to see that he is actually the most important. Second question that I have for you today. What are you holding on to? I have a hoarder in my family. And people who struggle with hoarding disorder, We'll collect all sorts of things that people on the outside looking in, for them, it doesn't make any sense. They look in and they say, you don't need this. Just get rid of it. Why can't you just get rid of this? But for someone who is experiencing a hoarding disorder, none of that is connected to what they're experiencing. For them, it's incredibly difficult. It's paramount that they do not get rid of the thing that they're holding onto. And regardless of whether it looks easy for anyone on the outside, for the person on the inside, it's hard to let go of that thing. Jesus says this in verse 25, verse 26. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? What is it that you're trying to gain in life? And what is it that you might be trying to gain where you're actually exchanging your life in a way that's not great? What is it that you're really holding on to? Or what is it that's holding on to you that has such a tight grip on you that it's actually hindering your ability to follow Jesus? These tend to be things like money, addictions, or even our comfort. We can hold on to our comfort so much that we can't actually follow Jesus where he is leading us. I think the key to this, well, one is understanding that those things ultimately end up being a burden for us. We hold on to them because we think it's going to provide life for us, but it actually ends up being like the yoke of an ox pulled over us that weighs us down. And we can get used to it, but it's actually not really good for us. Maybe it's some aspect of control, like what Kacy shared, that we hold on to control in our lives, and we're afraid to hand that over to Jesus. I think the key here in understanding is in verse 25, just right at the end. Jesus says, but whoever loses their life for me, or literally it says, for my sake, will find it. When we release control of the things that we're holding on to and we hand them over to Jesus, that's where we actually end up finding rest. And then regardless of our circumstances, whatever we might be facing in life, we can experience the rest of Jesus because we've learned to trust him that he's going to care for us better than the things we're trying to hold on to in some way. But it's about releasing control of those things. And it's hard because we want control. We're going to fight for it, like Kacy talked about. But also it's hard because following Jesus doesn't mean that everything's just going to turn out okay all the time. In fact, if you're paying attention to the context of this passage, you know it's really about death. Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. He's going to die on a cross. And he says, anyone who wants to follow me, you're going to have to lose your life in order to really find it. Will we trust Jesus enough regardless of where he's leading, even if it's in a place that takes us out of the safety and security that we rely on? Which really means, are we loyal enough to Jesus that we'll look to him above self-preservation in some way? And that's a big ask from Jesus. That's a lot of trust. I hope we have it. We probably do at times, and then there are other times when maybe we'd falter. But that's where we got to keep looking to Jesus. I'll leave you with one final question here. What is Jesus offering you? The last 3 days, I was on a father-son backpacking trip with all the dads of our life group and our sons. And we had a great time. I've been backpacking with kids before, but this time I forgot a crucial element of the child backpacking experience, which is the reward, the incentive for continuing on the hike. Because kids age 7 to 11 don't like backpacks that weigh a lot and climbing up hills all the time. I forgot it this time, but thankfully one of the dads had us all covered and he had brought Skittles. So Skittles was the reward system for keeping the kids going on the hikes. Here's what Jesus says, verse 27. For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what they have done. Jesus says there is a reward that's going to come. There is some kind of actual gain that he wants to give. And this gain, this reward, is probably akin to that parable from Jesus that I was telling you about, where the servant was awarded even more when he did well with what was entrusted to him. But I think that this reward isn't just something that's going to come in the future. And it's more than Skittles. It's more than a bag of gold. I think the reward is Jesus himself. What Jesus is offering is himself. His own life that we get to experience in our own lives as well. When we lose our lives, we're gonna find it, the true life, in Jesus. Which doesn't mean you're not important, which doesn't mean that you lose all your personality. It just means you get to experience a truer life than trying to hold on to all of the things of the world. But to have that life, you got to let go. And then Jesus is going to give you all the life that you need within the power of his Spirit. The problem is we have messy lives. And so it doesn't always look easy. It doesn't always come easy. It takes practice. It takes meditating on this passage a lot to hear these words from Jesus again and again. You may do that daily for a little while. Meditate on just that one verse. For those who want to be my disciples, they must deny themselves, pick up their cross and follow me. Lord, what do I have to do today? To let go, to deny myself, to pick up my cross, and to follow you today. We can trust that that's going to go well because Jesus did it before us. He denied himself by going to the cross. He did it first. He's trustworthy in that way. So we can trust him as we try to let go of those things and follow Jesus. And when we do, when we orient our lives daily around Jesus, what we're going to end up finding is that when we deny ourselves, we're actually going to be finding ourselves, our true selves in some way. It's kind of like, or when if we want to find rest in Jesus, we're going to find it just in him, and we're not going to find it in the other things that we're holding on to. Or if we want gain, that gain is going to come in the life of Jesus that's going to be better than any other gain in the world. It's like Kacy said in her story. If you're looking for the hero of this story, it's not me. That's the place we all need to get to, seeing Jesus as the most important. Let's pray. Jesus, you are the most important. You're the King. You're the one who went before us, gave everything for us so that we could experience real life. Help us to let go of the things that we're holding on to that we don't need to. Help us to recognize that we are important in your eyes. And because of your love for us, that is what gives us importance. Help us to see that we're important to you. And that you don't want to take things away from us, you want to give to us. You want to see us gain a whole lot, but not from this world, from you. Help us to trust you as we follow you daily. We love you. Amen.